When a movement is fresh and new, when it is at the first stages of struggle, of becoming the vision it seeks to achieve, men tend to dismiss it or shun it as something incorrigible. After all, we want to be part of something popular, something which is already successful, something which has been long established, so that we might say, I am a distinguished member of such and such. But alas, no movement begins this way. It begins with the faith and hope of a few. I say many of you here tonight represent the faith and hope of this few. At first, no one cared for the music of the German composer Gustav Mahler. But after his death, that is to say, after he was established, then people wanted to associate themselves with his music. By this act, they sought to distinguish themselves by appealing to an appreciation of that which was already distinguished. I submit to you that these are the most common people, and this is the most simplistic way, if not the most destructive way. This is why our poets and philosophers die in obscurity. I submit that it is a rare man indeed, a rare woman indeed, who can discern the genius of Mahler before Mahler has been established. For those of us who have been oriented into education, it is very easy to take education for granted. For some of us, this is a natural way of life. But what about those of us who were never initiated at a young age? What about those of us who came to education more eccentrically or later in life? I believe knowledge makes us more responsible as human beings. We have a duty to our species, to our fellow man. If we are the good brand of humanist, then we must reach out. We must desire to instill the gift of education, seeing this is the same gift we have received ourselves. And in order to sustain what we have, or this thing we are seeking to obtain, there can be no better advice than to surround ourselves with other passionate thinkers. One should seek out intelligent conversation. One should not merely desire the company of those who always agree, or those who can be easily pushed aside in the course of dialectic, but one should pursue the better player in order to be made better themselves. This is the purpose of our forum, to connect thinkers with other thinkers. There are no masters here. There are no gurus, no infallible teachers, only the force of the question. The podium here is open to all members. On your second meeting, you are free to do a reading, provided one has not already been scheduled. And on your third visit, you are free to give a lecture, provided the content is consistent with classical or philosophical themes. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Justin Burke. Originally from New Jersey, Dr. Burke studied at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where he completed a joint Master's of Arts degree in both moral philosophy and the history of art. He was subsequently a doctoral candidate at Oriel College, Oxford in England, where he undertook research on the philosopher Hegel. The degree of Doctor of Philosophy was conferred upon him by the University of Oxford in 1999 for his dissertation on Hegel's aesthetics. He is currently researching a book on the subject of existential suffering at the end of life, which he is writing with Dr. B.J. Miller of the University of California at San Francisco School of Medicine. His topic today is the ignorance of Socrates. This forum always follows the same format. There's a short reading, followed by a short lecture. Today's reading is from the French philosopher Merleau-Ponty. It is from his book In Praise of Philosophy, which consists of a series of lectures he gave at the College of France. The man who witnesses his own research, that is to say, his own inner disorder, cannot feel himself to be the heir of the distinguished men whose names he sees on these walls. If, in addition, he is a philosopher, that is to say, if he knows that he knows nothing. How could he believe himself justified in occupying this chair? And how could he even desire to do so? The answer to these questions is very simple. Since its foundation, the College of France has been charged with the duty not of giving to its hearers already acquired truths, but the idea of free investigation. If last winter the College of France desired to maintain a chair of philosophy, it is because philosophical ignorance puts the crowning touch on the spirit of search to which it is devoted. If a philosopher solicits your votes, my dear colleagues, it is, you well know, in order to live the philosophical life more completely. And if you have elected him, it is to support this endeavor in his person. Although I feel unequal to the honor, I am nevertheless happy to undertake the task, since it is a great good fortune, as Stendhal said, for one to have his passion as a profession. I have been touched at finding you so resolved, all other considerations aside, in desiring to maintain philosophy in your midst, and it is a pleasure to thank you for this today. Without doubt, I could not do better than to examine before you the function of the philosopher. First of all, as it was exercised by my predecessors, and then as it pertains to the function to consider both the past of philosophy and its present. The philosopher is marked by the distinguishing trait that he possesses inseparably the taste for evidence and the feeling for ambiguity. When he limits himself to accepting ambiguity, it is called equivocation. But among the great, it becomes a theme. It contributes to establishing certitudes rather than menacing them. Therefore, it is necessary to distinguish good and bad ambiguity. Even those who have desired to work out a completely positive philosophy have been philosophers only to the extent that, at the same time, they have refused the right to install themselves in absolute knowledge. They taught not this knowledge, but its becoming in us. Not the absolute, but at most, our absolute relation to it. As Kierkegaard said, what makes a philosopher is the movement which leads back without ceasing from knowledge to ignorance, from ignorance to knowledge, and a kind of rest in this movement. Dr. Burke.
Today we're considering ignorance and its relation to wisdom. When I say the word wisdom or wise, what do you think of? Who comes to mind? You could say Einstein, Marie Curie. I made a little list of my own: Stephen Hawking, Aristotle, Tesla. And then there's the namesake of the Forum, Socrates. I think a pretty good case could be made for including him as well. But don't take my word for it. A recent biography I saw that came out just last year describes Socrates as the quintessential philosopher, while the philosopher Hegel called him an intellectual hero, and says that in him we find a complete revolution in the Greek mind. Surprisingly, on perhaps this point alone, Hegel and bitter rival Schopenhauer agree, as Schopenhauer calls Socrates the wisest of mankind, the necessary starting point of all genuine philosophizing. I think you'll agree that we're starting to see a consensus forming here, that, assuming we leave out Nietzsche, who called Socrates the most problematic figure of ancient times, and not in a good way. So, how does what other philosophers say about Socrates compare with what we know about him ourselves? Well, if you were at the last forum, the debate a couple of weeks ago, you heard me make the opening remarks to that event, which included a few words about Socrates. I said he was a famous Greek philosopher, but also a very unconventional one. For example, he did not write a book, he did not found a school, he was not what we would call a professional philosopher, in that he did not make a living from it. And perhaps most unconventionally, he claimed to have no knowledge at all. In fact, the only thing of which Socrates claimed to be certain was his own ignorance. Yet we have seen he is considered to be the quintessential philosopher, the starting point of all philosophizing. And more than that, he is significant enough in the history of philosophy that philosophical time itself is measured in relation to him. You've got the pre-Socratics before him, and then there's everyone else after, with Socrates himself in between. What was it about him that was so different, so radical, in Hegel's words, so completely revolutionary? And how is that consistent with Socrates' claims to be devoid of knowledge? Our question then is this: could the practice of philosophy actually be compatible with Socrates' cultivation of ignorance? Cicero, the Roman lawyer, orator, politician, philosopher, etc., all-around quote machine, said in his Tusculan Disputations, Socrates was the first who called philosophy down from the heavens and placed it in cities, and introduced it even into homes, and compelled it to inquire into life and custom. How did Socrates do this? You would think that a project on this scale, a total reformation of philosophy, we might call it, would have had some basis in knowledge. Yet, as we have seen, Socrates claimed to have none. More confusing still, he described himself as having human wisdom, the source of which was his own ignorance. What is this supposed to mean? We certainly would not expect to hear Mozart describe himself as unmusical or Michelangelo inartistic, because those descriptions are demonstrably false. Just as Mozart epitomizes the idea of musicality, we think of Socrates doing the same in the realm of philosophy. He is, judging from the quotations above, the philosopher's philosopher. So how does that idea coexist with Socrates' claims to ignorance? Socrates lived in the 5th century BCE, and he was accused of impiety and of corrupting the minds of the youth of Athens. Pretty flimsy charges by today's standards, of course, but he was actually brought to trial on these grounds. And Athens may have been a democracy, but it was one without the guarantee of free speech. Socrates' follower Plato, who was probably in his late 20s when this trial took place, based a book on it called The Apology. But by no means should this title be taken to suggest that Socrates apologized for anything he had done. Far from it, as we shall see. In Greek, apologia means defense, as in a legal case such as this. In the Apology, Socrates describes his life as a philosopher and explains how, and more importantly, why he went about what he considered to be his life's work. And as you'd expect in any good courtroom drama, during the proceedings, at the last minute, he calls a surprise witness. In an unexpected and astonishing move, Socrates says, I will refer you to a witness who is worthy of credit and will tell you about my wisdom, whether I have any or not, and of what sort it may be. Does anyone know this story? Who does Socrates call as his witness? In the Apology, he says, that witness shall be the god of Delphi. Yes, Socrates calls Apollo, the god of light, of truth, of knowledge, prophecy, to be his witness in court. Now, since it was impractical to subpoena Apollo personally, the court had to accept Socrates' own testimony, which apparently they did. There's another version of this trial written by another follower of Socrates named Xenophon, and his account also includes the story of the oracle, though the details are slightly different. Socrates tells the jury that a friend had gone to the temple of Apollo at Delphi to ask the oracle, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? And the priestess's stunning answer was simply, there is none wiser. Socrates was shocked. When I heard this reply, he said, I asked myself, whatever does the god mean? What is his riddle? I am only too conscious that I have no claim to wisdom, great or small. So what can he mean by saying, I am the wisest of men? The philosopher Diogenes was an oddball, to say the least, as anyone who knows anything about him will agree. He was quite a bit younger than Socrates, who himself was considered a strange character around Athens, but Diogenes was described as Socrates gone mad. Just imagine the cast of characters, the Greek philosophers. Diogenes was said to carry a lighted lantern in the daytime. Why did Socrates do this? Does anyone remember that? That's right. Diogenes said he was searching for an honest man. In the same way, Socrates tells the jury he set out to find a wise man. In the Apology, he says he first approached a politician, which was probably his first mistake. But he said this man appeared wise to many people, and especially to himself. Unfortunately, however, after sustained questioning, Socrates said he determined that this purportedly wise man was in fact not wise at all. Then, very generously, he says, I tried to show him that he thought himself wise, but that he was not. As a result, he came to dislike me. and so did many of the bystanders. The picture which Socrates paints here to comic effect is one of public humiliation, rapid-fire questioning out in the open in the presence of witnesses. This is the model for what would become known as the Socratic Method. It also reveals the first stirrings of public distaste and resentment for this kind of philosophizing, called down from heaven and brought into the cities, as Cicero put it. Socrates later describes himself as a gadfly, buzzing around from place to place in Athens, which he compares to a horse in need of being stung into action. It seems to me that the god has attached me to this city to perform the duty of such a fly, and all day long never cease to settle here and there and everywhere, rousing, persuading, reproving every one of you. His fear, though, he says, is that before long you will awake from your dozing and in your annoyance finish me off with a single smack and then go on sleeping until the end of your days. Socrates' description of his activities and their purpose reminds me here of Immanuel Kant. In the Prolegomena to any future metaphysic that will be able to come forth as science, which is my favorite philosophy book title, he says, I freely admit that the remembrance of David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, was the very thing that many years ago first interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave a completely different direction to my researches in the field of speculative philosophy. This is what Socrates says he was trying to do for the people of Athens, to awaken them from their dogmatic slumber, whether, like Kant, they would admit to appreciating the favor or not. Get rid of me and you'll soon regret it, he tells the court. He was sent as a gift from the god, and the city will not soon find anyone to take his place. In silencing him, he says, they'll harm themselves more than they will him. Returning to Socrates' quest to find a wise man, after his initial confrontation with the politician, he says he began to realize that the oracle might have been right, in an ironic, paradoxical sort of way. He consoled himself by saying, well, I'm certainly wiser than this man. It is likely that neither of us knows anything worthwhile, but he thinks he knows something when he does not, whereas when I do not know, neither do I think that I know. To test this new hypothesis, Socrates approaches the poets, dramatic, lyric, and all the rest, he says. He asks them about their most significant works, hoping to learn their deeper meanings. But he is surprised to discover, he says, that almost any bystander, again in public, any bystander might have explained those poems better than their authors could have. His analysis of the situation is that poets do not compose their poems with knowledge, but by some inborn talent and by inspiration, like seers and prophets, who also say many fine things without understanding. I think that's like the Delphic oracle itself, in which the priestess has revealed something without understanding, which Socrates is attempting to interpret for himself, what it means to be wise. His conclusion this time is that because of their poetry, the poets thought themselves very wise men in other respects, which unfortunately they were not. So there again, I withdrew, thinking that I had the same advantage over them as over the politicians. Finally, he sought out the craftsmen, sure he would find them full of impressive knowledge of many fine things. And this time he was not disappointed, though he was still unable to refute the oracle, since, as he says, these good artisans fell into the same error as the poets. On the strength of their technical proficiency, they claimed a perfect understanding of every other subject as well, however important, and this defect in them overshadowed their wisdom. Socrates then asks himself whether I should prefer to be as I am, with neither their wisdom nor their ignorance, or to have both, to be skilled in their techniques while at the same time ignorant without knowing it. His answer, of course, was that it would be better to remain as he was, ignorant but free of false beliefs. So Socrates has clearly failed in refuting the oracle, which said not that he was the wisest man in the world, or even in Greece, but that there was no one wiser, which we can be sure must have been some consolation in itself. Like Diogenes with his lamp, Socrates, in the dialogues of Plato, is seeking out wisdom, always, but rarely, if ever, finding it. Many dialogues end in aporia, the Greek word for doubt or uncertainty. In others, where Socrates appears to be discoursing knowledgeably, he often attributes his wisdom to another, as in Symposium, where he defers credit for his speech on love, which is really the centerpiece of that book, to Diotima, a woman who was a kind of tutor to him. And in Meno, he refers to certain priests and priestesses who taught him about the immortality of the soul. In the Apology, Socrates says he feels compelled by the god to live the life of a philosopher, which he describes as a constant examination of himself and others. What is undoubtedly Socrates' most famous statement appears in Apology, when he says that the unexamined life is not worth living. A more literal translation from the Greek would be, the unexamining life is no life for man. And I think this is a significant difference. The word usually translated as unexamined, anexetastos, and this is the only philology we're going to be doing today. This is not actually a past participle. It is a nominative adjective. Unexamined isn't necessarily wrong. It is the correct way to form a negative adjective from the word examine. Say we were out in the forest picking mushrooms. You have to examine them carefully so you don't eat the wrong kind and poison yourself. So we have two groups. Here are the mushrooms we've examined, and these are the ones we haven't examined yet. So these are the examined mushrooms, these the unexamined mushrooms. And that's a little different from an unexamined life, which may or not be worth living. Why? Because my life is still going on. It's not something like a mushroom that I can examine and then move on to something else. Socrates' life was an ongoing process, and it was his continuous examination of it and the lives of his fellow Athenians that made living it worthwhile. Earlier I said Socrates did not make a living from philosophy, but in a sense we can see that he was living a life of philosophy. That's probably what that biography meant in calling him the quintessential philosopher. Unfortunately, in the end, Socrates failed to convince the jury, who convicted him and called for his execution. But Socrates, being Socrates, and therefore having no knowledge of death, whether it is a good or a bad thing, or simply a state of nothingness, like the deepest sleep you ever had in your life, Socrates gets the last laugh as he's led out of court. He says to the jury, "Now the time has come for us to part, and we must go our separate ways. I to die, and you to live. But which of us goes to the better lot? Only the god knows." The end. I'll take a few questions if there are any.
Yes. You mentioned that Nietzsche was a naysayer of Socrates. Can you name off the top of your head a few of the reasons why he said that?
Yeah, I've got some quotes here, actually. He called Socrates anti-Greek. He said he was the opposite of what he saw as the tradition in Greek philosophy up to that point. He thought he destroyed philosophy. This is in the Twilight of the Idols, I think. There's a section of that book called The Problem of Socrates.
Okay.
Socrates is the worst philosopher in the world for Nietzsche. Maybe next to Hegel, perhaps.
And why was that? Because of his introduction?
He thought it was his influence over Euripides, that Euripides was, in the tradition of Greek tragedy, he was too influenced by the logical ideas of Socrates, that the passion, the emotion, the Dionysian was overcome by the Apollonian, if that's the contrast that Nietzsche is drawing, and that Greek tragedy from that point on had been destroyed. That was really the end. This is he also discussed it in his first book, In Birth of Tragedy. I'm not a Nietzsche expert, but I did look into this recently. Yeah.
The Greek word for wisdom, does it correspond roughly to what we mean by wisdom? Because you mentioned like Einstein, right? So Einstein would be someone, I guess I would think that what I think of as like, a genius, brilliant. But I don't know if he was wise. Because
exactly.
I would say maybe like Winston Churchill would be someone.
You have Churchill, Mandela, people who seem to have, what is the difference between them? Because you've got geniuses like maybe Einstein or even Mozart, or people who could be very precocious, right? They don't have any experience. They're just suddenly producing music or doing mathematical, I just read about some person who went to University of Chicago as a teenager, at the age of 14 or something, and had a PhD by 20. There are people like that. They have no wisdom, right? They just have academic experience or something like that. So in Greek, there are a lot of the words. There's a lot of overlap. Just the word philosophy in English, the word that we use for philosophy the fact that the degree you get as a doctor of philosophy, that's not necessarily in philosophy, right? I mean, I just happen to have a doctor of philosophy in philosophy. But you can get that in chemistry, you can get it in medicine, you can get it in anything. So the word that we use for philosophy today used to mean a lot of different things in Greek, in ancient Greek. And the pre-Socratics, I've got notes that I prepared, but I didn't give anything on the pre-Socratics. What they thought philosophy was to describe the origin of the universe. And Xenophon, the other biographer, or the other writer on Socrates, said that Socrates never attempted to describe the origin of the universe. That this was
Cosmology.
right. This was a topic that Socrates didn't address. He was interested in quizzing, questioning, and using his method against people who talk that kind of way. Like, what evidence is there that all is water, or the soul arises from earth, or whatever? So, about the word, philosophy, wisdom, science, there was a lot of overlap at that time.
So that the practical skill that a craftsman would have, would that be wisdom, or?
Well, it does come from experience. I mean, you don't just, unless you have beginner's luck, you're not usually a good craftsperson right off the bat. So there is some wisdom in that.
Right.
And Socrates does admit that he found some wisdom there, but he still didn't think it made them wiser than himself because they were ignorant about everything else, about what he would call the big issues. They might be able to make shoes or train horses or something, but he felt that wasn't significant wisdom about the larger issues of the time.
So what is your answer to the topic? So what did Socrates actually mean when he claimed ignorance?
I think he is just a conduit for questioning. That's what distinguishes him from the pre-Socratics. They're going to come out and just pontificate to you, right? Or the sophists. I didn't mention the sophists. That's the other group prior to Socrates. To them, argument was everything. That a good sophist was someone who could take the weak argument and beat someone with a stronger argument. So the content of sophism was not what was important. It was the persuasion, the rhetoric of that. And Socrates is the person who comes along and blows that up. Like, people don't study. I mean, people rarely study sophistry today, or the sophist period, and pre-Socratics is an interesting study, but almost it's totally different. You're not reading Plato or Aristotle when you're reading pre-Socratic philosophy. So did I answer your question? What do I feel? I feel that it is possible to occupy a position of ignorance. Some people call that Socratic irony. They think that it's an ironic posture. I'm not so sure. I mean, we don't really even know. All we have is a characterization of Socrates, provided mostly by Plato, also by Xenophon, and it seems pretty consistent. Even in the later dialogues, you see him, like I mentioned the symposium, where he is discoursing, but he's always careful. I noticed that right away. I thought, why isn't he speaking freely? He says, I learned this from this woman. The woman told me about the truth of love. And he doesn't take credit for himself. And now, having worked on this topic, I see why. That it fits in with the narrative, the biography that is either constructed about him or was perhaps true. So I think it's a position that can be successful in philosophy, or at least it's possible.
Would you speak a little bit more towards revelation without understanding?
What is it? Revelation?
Revelation without understanding.
Oh, you mean when Socrates says that?
Yes. I mean, in the strict definition of the word, somebody must understand to make it a revelation. So if you're speaking, are you speaking just strictly towards the revealer?
Well, he was talking about poets. He feels that you could be a great poet. I think this is true. I've seen this case. I mean, I studied art history, as Jersey mentioned. The first person to ask about the meaning of art is maybe not the artist. The artist's job is to create the artwork. I mean, we say there's a division of labor. That artist probably has an opinion about that artwork, but it's not definitive. A lot of people, or a lot of artists, whoever they are, poets, painters, architects, they don't like to speak publicly about their work. They say, I made the work. You can look at it. Because if I start telling you what I think, then that's going to become the accepted interpretation. So, and I think Socrates comes upon that in an interesting way just by saying that the poets, people in the street, could explain the poems better. But he didn't say they could write better poems. The poets, the lyric poets, he mentions them by name, actually, the Greek names of the different kinds of poetry. And he says they create the poems, but people in the street are perhaps better at reading them.
So that opens the door to multiple understandings.
Of course.
Which wouldn't necessarily go with a philosopher that is telling you exactly one thing.
Right, that would be more, well, if I were a sophist, I could come in, I could explain a poem to you, I could give you a speech and whatever, and then someone else could come in and tell you it actually means something totally different. But that wouldn't be seen as a philosophical issue anyway. I mean, that, after the time of Socrates, philosophy wouldn't have been arguing about poems. While prior to Socrates, philosophy was often written in the form of poems. If you read the little fragments we have from Anaximander or Heraclitus or whatever, the fragments are often very poetic and require a lot of interpretation. But that's a very different study of philosophy. Was there one back here?
Oh, yeah. Is Pyrrho after Socrates?
Pyrrho?
Pyrrho?
Yes.
The Pyrrhonians are after. Okay.
Yeah, Socrates pretty far back. When Socrates was a young man, he's said to have known Parmenides, and I thought, wow, Parmenides is from just a previous epoch of philosophical history, but Socrates was that old. When he was executed in negative 399, he was about 70 years old. So he wasn't, cut off in his prime. In fact, Xenophon's argument was that Socrates probably wanted to die because he was so old. That's why he didn't resist. That's why he didn't resist the sentence. Did you have one?
Yeah, well, I just wondered what sort of scope you think there might be for Socratic Method for teaching in schools, for instance.
Apparently a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all over the internet. If you type in Socratic Method, I was surprised what I found on teaching. It's not strict, I wouldn't call it strict Socratic Method, but I think it's something developed from the early Platonic dialogues anyway. Did you have a further point to make about that?
Well, generally there tends to be a bit of a dichotomy between, say, the Platonic method and the Socratic method, where I think Plato tends to have the idea that material that exists ought to be taught beforehand, and then allowing the students to digest what's known, and then come to what's not known. Whereas the Socratic method tends to be sort of more bottom-up in a way.
Well, I thought about that. I thought, well, what could the teacher occupy a position of ignorance? Like that doesn't seem like our idea of education. I think teaching is more like sophistry, right? You've got the idea, you walk in, and the students are supposed to learn it, and when they grow up, then they can make up their own minds. But I have seen that it is suggested. I think the idea is that it just introduces more questioning, more dialogue. It's not, I'm going to stand here and nobody's going to say anything for the next hour, and you're going to learn what I say. So I think it's just a way to open up the classroom. But in strict philosophical terms, I think it probably would not work. I mean, that would be with a bunch of kids. I don't know. Maybe not.
There's actually a university called St. John's University, which is like a great books university, and they use that model. So like the teachers are not like PhDs in their specialty. So you might have like a music teacher teaching science. They have to study it, but the idea is that everyone's trying to learn together. So whether that's a good idea, I don't know. But
at a university level?
Yeah, that's it. It's a well-known great books university called St. John's University.
I think I'd probably want a physicist teaching me physics, though.
Yeah.
I mean, but
exactly. But if you have scientists teaching, humanities,
interesting.
So what does Socrates say about passions then? So is that the point in history the passions are just discarded and the focus on philosophy then is the mind and its
I thought of this today that, the music he was playing earlier was Bach, and Bach wrote a very extended piece of music called the Well-Tempered Clavier, which was a prelude and a fugue in every single key of the equally tempered keyboard, where there's just a half step between every. It got rid of all. In music we only have two modes now, major and minor. There used to be many, many different modes, and they junked them. They threw them out, and they said it's just going to be major and minor, and we're going to have one half step between every no quarter tones, no microtones, and I think that was Nietzsche's point about what happens with Euripides and Greek tragedy after that. That everything has to be. If it doesn't make sense, you can't talk about it. There's no kind of maybe like passion, and kind of feeling. If it doesn't make sense, it can't go in your play. It can't go in your poem.
Then it's not considered philosophy anymore.
Or anything. I mean, it's not considered suitable for drama because the audience itself is supposed to be under the influence of this, logic and rationality that's It's supposed to arrive from Socrates. Like if I say something that's not, like if I say one thing that sounds good, but then Socrates says, well, earlier you said something else, and those things don't go together, you have to reject them, right? That's the Socratic method. You say, well, earlier you said justice was the interest of the stronger person, but now you say it's doing better for your friends or something like that. So then you have to dump it. You can't hold contrary things, like an equal temperament. You can't keep.
Oh, is that because Aristotle's principle of non-contradiction?
Well, that's part of it. I
That's
mean,
about the time that came out, but before that you could have contradictions.
Perhaps, or no one would have noticed.
They never crossed, they stayed parallel.
It may not have been noticed without a Socratic questioner.
At the same time as the schools, right? So things had to be, sounds like things maybe had to be simplified.
Well, there is a progression.
Or another now, and before they were more complex.
Sure, because Socrates' student was Plato, or his follower anyway. Socrates claimed he didn't have anything to teach, but his follower Plato set up the academy. Aristotle set up the Lyceum. I mean, these are obviously structured. There must be some structured format for learning. And while with Socrates, so you've come a long way from some barefoot guy in the street to a structured academic program. I don't know what the program was at the Lyceum or the academy, but there must have been something because they were formal schools.
So that might explain why it then focuses suddenly on the mind and things that can be the intellect. Because what else would you do?
Well, it certainly comes out of Socratic method.